Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legend of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we are going to talk about champions and champion reworks, because I think that this is quite an interesting little topic. It's something that I brought up yesterday. If you haven't seen yesterday's video about Riot Rubenzu talking about the game, then I very much, would go back and watch that, because one, it's just interesting to hear what the devs think. And, you'll probably learn something. But one of the things that he said was that they probably aren't going to be doing any champion reworks. Now, let's start off with, what does that mean? Well, basically, I take that to mean that essentially any card text on a champion is unlikely to change. Or definitely, a complete change of text. Maybe you can add in, a little thing on the text. A good example would be Vladimir. They did this with, that's not Vladimir, that's Swain. Vladimir, they did this a while ago. They added just this and drain 1. Maybe something like that could happen, but big changes of text. We haven't really seen that much anyway, for champions. Perhaps the biggest example was Braum, where they completely added this new ability, right? They made Braum from a 3-mana 0/5 that just, had the keywords and the level up, and they added this text about surviving damage, summoning a mighty Poro, etc, etc. So that would count as a rework, or obviously a redesign, obviously a complete redesign of a champion where you scrap the initial idea and completely change it would obviously be a rework as well. But it seems that Riot, doesn't want to go in that direction with champions, and most, changes to champions are going to be, numbers based, or, maybe the odd slight bit of text change, but very, very limited in that scope. So, what do we think about this? Is this a good idea? Is this not a bad idea? So, what do I think about this? Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? There is a lot of champions that don't see much play that I'm sure many of you think could be, doing better if they did get a rework and the like. But I am here to argue to you today that this is actually a good idea on the whole to not try and rework champions. So why do I think that we can go without reworking champions? Well, it essentially boils down to the fact that pretty much with just numerical changes, we could probably all accept that whatever you think is a bad champion or a champion that needs a rework, if you gave them, plus 3/3 in stats, but didn't change their mana cost, or made them cost 2 less mana, you can probably accept that most champions at that point would go from, even if they're the worst champion in the game, in your eyes, would go from really bad to insanely good, if not, of course, really broken, right? We can all accept that. And so that means pretty much for most champions then, that there probably is an in-between. If you can make every champion go from, even if it's the worst champion in the game, to the best champion in the game by just changing the numbers, that means that there is probably an amount of change, obviously a lot smaller than giving something -2 mana cost. We've seen that doesn't work. Cough, cough, Lee Sin. But if we move away from that, there is a change that can make these champions go from, borderline unplayable to a good level. As we saw with Lee Sin, they eventually got it right. We eventually saw that we got to a 5-mana Lee Sin, which is much more acceptable than the 4-mana Lee Sin, right? It just took us a while to get to that stage, and probably a bit longer than we would have hoped. But I think that those kind of changes can be done and can make a champion very good. Now, why would you want to rework a champion instead of, just buffing a champion? Because I know that some of you are bringing up concerns that, it's not all about power level of cards, and I completely accept that, right? There are some champions in the game, to me very few, but there are some, that their abilities don't make that much sense. They seem a bit redundant. They seem like they don't quite work that well at the moment, and I'm going to bring up some specific examples. So there are a couple champions that I could see an argument for a rework. Don't get me wrong. I can definitely see some arguments for some very limited pool of champions. But I know that a lot of you are probably thinking about champions like Katarina, who's one of the worst champions in the game, that a lot of people would say this champion needs a complete rework. Champions like Braum, that hasn't seen really any play at all. But I don't think that champions like this really need a rework. Let me explain. So let's take Katarina as our example, right? Probably the worst champion in the game. Hasn't seen any play really ever, even in the base beta set. So could we buff Katarina? Well, yes, of course. We could bring the mana cost down of Katarina, and Katarina, I think, would be a fine champion. There are obviously problems with Katarina. Her champion spell is very confusing. It doesn't really work with the champion at all. It's quite weird that that is the champion spell, right? So if we're not going to change this because we're only changing numbers, that will always be a bit awkward, don't get me wrong. But Katarina is unique, and her ability does make sense. Having one card be a consistent rally effect is a good effect to have. Sure, it hasn't been like a good card, but this effect, this principle, this idea could be a good idea. I'm sure we can all probably accept that. The problem with Katarina is, of course, there are 2 rally cards already that exist that are really good in Demacia, of course, and that negates Katarina's ability to see play for a start, because, they kind of are just better than Katarina already, and you don't need to use a champion slot, and it works better with the region that it's in, perhaps. So, there's a lot of things going on there that make Relentless Pursuit and Golden Age just better than Katarina. Also, Katarina is pretty weak. She's a very slow tempo thing, but we could figure that out by making Katarina, for instance, cost less mana. That would solve the sort of tempo issues with Katarina. And also, if you think about it, if we nerf things like Relentless Pursuit and Golden Age, something that we might want to do anyway, that's not like a crazy idea anyway, because those are very, very powerful cards. That makes Katarina better as well. Just because those cards become worse, that means that the viability of Katarina goes up. And so this is the thing, right? It's not just that we can buff certain champions, but if there are cards that have similar effects to them that are really good, we can potentially tone them down so that, Katarina could become the premier rally effect in the game. That is, if I was designing the game, that is what I would be pushing to do, because that's what champions should be. All the champions in the game should be like, their leveled up form should be the best version of an effect. That should be, the best thing we can do. You take, for instance, Ezreal, right? Like, Ezreal deals damage to the enemy nexus, when we're targeting units and killing units and stuff like that. They recently brought out a card, a 4-mana 2/4. Yes, this Watcher on the Isles, right? If you read this, it's kind of similar to Ezreal in a way. It's a kind of similar effect, but it's definitely worse than Ezreal. And I think that those kind of things are important to find for the champions, is that they should all just be the best effect of whatever their leveled up form is doing. They should be the best version of that. And there shouldn't be any followers or spells that do it better. And so things like that, when we change the balance of multiple cards perhaps, that can make a champion more viable. But I am going to go on now to some champions that I do think, don't make as much sense. And I'm going to start with Yasuo. Yasuo is a champion to me that just doesn't make that much sense. And there's actually a lot of people who like Yasuo. And don't get me wrong, I do think that, again, there are ways of making Yasuo pretty good. Things like Yasuo having a tutor. A lot of people have pointed out that that would be very good, because a lot of these stun decks rely on Yasuo quite heavily. And if you don't draw Yasuo, you're kind of just stuck there, not doing that much. So, giving a tutor for Yasuo, which very easily could be done, could be quite helpful. Obviously, making better stun cards would also help Yasuo. Maybe if there's, stuns that, kind of like Gravitum, that stun multiple turns, that's the kind of thing that would help Yasuo as well, if they counted for like 2 of his level up, for instance. But Yasuo has always just been a bit redundant, because when you stun or recall, particularly recall something, dealing the damage to it doesn't really matter that much. If you've sent a 6-mana 6/6 back to their hand, with a Will of Ionia or something, like dealing 2 or even 5 damage to that unit, it is completely redundant, because they just get it back and it's got all of its health back, right? So Yasuo can be a bit redundant. And also with stuns as well, you're taking them out of combat. So, it's not completely redundant if the game is going on, for some time still. But the problem is, if you don't draw Yasuo until those late turns, the game isn't going on that long. So, dealing the damage to them probably isn't doing that much really, because the stun will even allow you to, attack in and have that extra space on the board that your opponent might not have, or it might stop their attack. And so, yeah, it's just a bit redundant. So Yasuo is one that I could kind of see, but I do still think, that with, if Yasuo was 3 mana, for instance, and could start, dealing damage to units, dealing 2 damage to, like, units on turn 3, it's probably going to kill quite a few units. Turn 4 might be a bit slow for Yasuo, but I do still think there is ways of balancing Yasuo, and also adding in extra cards that could help Yasuo become a prominent champion in the game. And this is kind of the key points, right? Vladimir is another one, where, to me, is a bit redundant. Vladimir never really has figured out what kind of champion he wants to be. Does he want to be an aggro champion? Does he want to be a mid-range champion? He's dealing damage to the enemy nexus. You're kind of sacrificing your own units to deal damage to the enemy nexus. That's a very aggressive thing. But then for some reason, they kind of just kept leaning into this mid-range style with Vladimir, when they tried to give him Drain. Now, draining, you would kind of think that wants the game to go on a bit longer, which maybe would be more mid-range for a 5-mana card that wants the game to go on a bit longer. So, bit weird. Vladimir, I've always thought, but again, you can print cards and you can make cards to help Vladimir out, and you can make cards that give him a sort of bigger purpose. For instance, Scargrounds was one of these cards, right? Scargrounds was a very good start for Vladimir because it kind of lent into more of the kind of mid-range plan, right? I'm going to give all my units tough, they're going to survive damage, and, even a buff to, for instance, like the Scargrounds, would help Vladimir out a lot. You don't even need to buff the actual card itself, but just buff key cards around these champions, and you can end up with some pretty nasty things. So, again, whilst a rework, I think, for those examples wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, I do still think it makes sense. And then there's also champions like Leona, I think, is a pretty good example. And this is something else that they could do, because Leona has always just been on her own. There is no other Daybreak champion in the game, but there seems to be plenty of opportunity that they could have done that. We all, maybe not we all, but, I think quite a few of us almost expected there to be a Daybreak champion in Shurima. It kind of just made a lot of sense. But that didn't come for whatever reason. But it always could come. They always could make another Daybreak champion. We're getting to the point now probably where, the champions that are coming out in this next, couple sets are probably ones that they started designing when Targon was out and they could see the results of Targon. So maybe, these next couple champions are the ones where they've seen Leona isn't seeing any play because there's no other Daybreak cards. Let's make another Daybreak champion. And, they'll pick a champion, whatever they want it to be. And, they could make another Daybreak champion. And then you could have a full Daybreak deck that would make a lot of sense. And Leona could see play. So I think there's plenty of different ways that you can make these champions viable without necessarily needing to rework them. As I've kind of gone over, it's not just about the champion itself. It's about kind of key cards that come with them. It's about other cards in the game not being better than them, like with Katarina, for instance. And it's about creating this sort of sense of a whole deck, like with Leona, where, you do need to have a full package, but they can always bring that out later on. And so I don't think, really, that we need to be reworking too many of these champions, because I think there are plenty of these champions that you could easily buff. Now, let's take Aphelios as an example, right? We know that the moon weapons are too good at 2 mana. We know that the moon weapons are too bad at 3 mana. So, what do? Well, we could do a couple things still, I think. We could make Aphelios cost 2 mana if we wanted. And bring down his stats a bit and just make him a 2 mana champion so that you can get these moon weapons online earlier. Yes, they do cost more, but you're getting them earlier on and you're getting that kind of snowball effect earlier on, and Aphelios costs less mana himself. That's the kind of thing that you could do to try and help Aphelios. Or would this count as a redesign if they, just slightly tweaked some of the key, words on the blades? I don't know if that counts as a rework. Maybe it does in your eyes, in which case I guess that's banned for this. So how would we do that? Well, one thing that I think a lot of people have said in the past is giving spells a tune would be a very good idea to balance things that are too good at 1 mana cost but too bad at another mana cost. maybe you could give these spells a tune. I don't know if that would make sense, lore-wise, because I'm not a lore expert, but those are the kind of things that are available to them if they wanted to. You add a tune onto these spells, and all of a sudden you kind of have like a 2.5 mana cost spell. You need the 3 mana to play it, but then you get 1 back, so it's kind of like 2.5 mana overall. That's a good way to balance these spells, I think, in my opinion. So, that's basically my piece on this, that we don't need to be reworking that many champions, because I think that there are good enough options out there and tools for the developers of this game to utilize, to where they can just go about changing these cards, in basic numbers terms, to end up with, a healthy balance in the game and get these champions to see play. Because sometimes, these champions are just waiting for, the other right cards to come out. Zilean is a good example with Xerath, where Zilean made absolutely no sense before. Now with Zilean Xerath, he makes a lot more sense, and, that's a nice little tier 2 deck that he's found himself in. Whereas people before would have said that Zilean was complete trash and could never see play. But that's just not how it really works. So that's my opinion on this. I'd love to hear some of your opinions. What champions, I brought up a few. What champions do you think don't make sense? And might really need a rework. But we'll see. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and have a really nice day.